Hey everybody, thank you for joining us today for this Southern Legislative Conference SLC webinar entitled States Act to Bolster Transportation Funding. I am Sujit Kanagaretna, Senior Fiscal Analyst for the Southern Legislative Conference, the Southern Office of the Council of State Governments. Our sincere thanks to our distinguished panel, Senator Mullis from Georgia, Senator Gooch from Georgia, Senator Cleary from South Carolina, and Jason Powell from the Senate Finance Committee in Virginia for setting aside time in their busy schedules to talk to us today about the reforms they are initiating in their states. I also want to thank Heather Perkins in CSG's Lexington office for taking care of all the technical aspects related to this webinar. Before I hand off to Senator Bill Sample, Chair of the Arkansas Senate Transportation, Technology, and Legislative Affairs Committee, and Chair of the SLC's Economic Development, Transportation, and Cultural Affairs Committee, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items first. You are all in listen-only mode. If you wish to ask a question, please use the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbar. You may type in a question at any time during the webinar, and we will try to get to them at the end. We will be recording this webinar and posting it later on the CSG Knowledge Center website, knowledgecenter.csg.org, and the SLC website, slcatlanta.org. Senator Sample, over to you.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to this SLC webinar on transportation. Given the inertia in the federal level, states have been forced to enact a range of options to restore and rebuild their transportation and infrastructure network. In the last few legislative sessions, dozens of states across the country have introduced and sometimes enacted reform measures to adequately fund these networks. Adequate and ongoing infrastructure investments are critical for economic growth. Even in my home state of Arkansas, during the 2013 session, we had intense discussions and legislation proposed to devote revenue from vehicle sales tax to highway construction and maintenance. Even though this proposal did not clear the House Transportation Committee, I know we will tackle transportation funding in 2014. In 2012, Arkansas voters did approve a half-cent sales tax to increase and cover a $1.3 billion bond issue for roads and bridges. We're delighted to have with us a distinguished panel from Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia to educate us about recent efforts in their states to strengthen transportation and infrastructure investments. We will first feature the great state of Georgia, and I am happy to introduce my friend, the Vice Chair of SLC's Economic Development, Transportation, and Cultural Affairs Committee, and the Chair of the Georgia Senate Rules Committee, Senator Jeff Mullis. Senator Mullis will be joined by Georgia Senator Steve Gooch, who is currently the Chair of the Transportation Committee in the State Senate. We will then hear from Senator Raymond E. Cleary from the great state of South Carolina. Senator Cleary was at the forefront in moving legislation to rebuild South Carolina's infrastructure this year and will give us details on his efforts during the 2013 legislative year. Finally, we will hear from Jason Powell, legislative analyst with the Senate Finance Committee from the great state of Virginia. Virginia is a state that enacted far-reaching reforms this year to fund transportation and infrastructure products in a bipartisan manner. Each of our presenters will speak about 12 minutes. Please feel free to submit your questions as they come up throughout the program, and we will try to answer as many as we have time at the end. Senator Mullis, Senator Gooch, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank you for your leadership in the SLC committee and all the work that you are doing in the great state of Arkansas. And thank you, Sujit, for arranging this today. As you know, we're all struggling with funding for transportation, and Georgia's we're not alone, everyone is. And if you go to the next slide, please. we first started by identifying substantial sources for funding for the future in the state, and to know our federal levels too. And the state of Georgia Senate and House Transportation Committee passed a joint study resolution, and we crisscrossed the state of Georgia about 6 or 7 years ago to try to find a solution for funding, because as we all know, funding primarily is based on a gallon of fuel sold in our states, and with that, with the people driving more fuel-efficient cars and consolidating their trips or going shorter distances for vacation or not going at all, it has reduced the amount of funds coming for transportation. So we had to consolidate what we needed to do too. Well, through our quest and our study committee, we found a lot of things that helps transportation, but we really didn't find the funding solution we needed, and we'll get to that later in our presentation. But we addressed the current congestions in metro area Atlanta, and I'm sure in your states, the busiest cities, you all have major transportation and congestion areas, and we are not without that either, especially in the Atlanta metro area, which in the past has been some of the most congested areas in the United States, and we still struggle with that as well. We encourage economic opportunities across the state of Georgia with strategic transportation investments and also planning. We realized that without a roadmap, and we couldn't get to where we needed to do. We wanted to maintain a state of good repair over 47,600 lane miles of interstate and state routes. Next slide, please. Priorities, we prioritize our projects based on the level of need and the citizens that we serve. And as you know, many citizens will let you know what needs to be taken care of first, and it's always a little more selfishly targeted, I guess. But we had to find a way to make sure that we prioritize what we had to do. We found creative ways to work with less funding. As you know, with struggles in our budgets, we're all doing a lot more with a lot less, and that does not leave out transportation. So we tried to embrace new business models. We streamlined and aligned operation models to achieve private sector efficiencies for public service deliveries. We know that, no offense to our state employees, but sometimes bureaucracy gets in the way, and it's hard to change the old method. But by bringing the private sector in, we saw that we could do it better and more efficiently. We increased the use of contractors and consultants to fill in critical areas while maintaining sovereign controls, checks, and balances. In the government, of course, we can put a lot of that in place, as you know. Next slide, please. Georgia, and we like to claim that we have one of the lowest excise taxes on a gallon of gas, which is not always good, 7.5 cents a gallon, but we also have a 3% sales tax that's placed on by the state and sometimes local entities too, and that escalates the price of gas in the state of Georgia according to the level of the original base price. But of course, the number of gallons sold is reducing as, again, more cars are more fuel efficient. But there are no guaranteed state funding sources for transit, aviation, trails, or other non-highway modes of travel. And our motor fuel tax, our excise tax, is strictly for roads and bridges by our Constitution in the state of Georgia. So we have to use our general fund out of our budget, in which you know how competitive those dollars are for everyone, and very little goes to the other modes of transportation other than roads and bridges. Of course, the expiration of the federal funds in 2014 and depleted highway trust funds create uncertainties. As you know, they haven't passed the budget I don't know how long in the federal government, unlike we states balance our budget every year for the most part. Next slide, please. So we're seeking alternative finance methods for projects, including public-private partnerships, P3s as we call them, and design builds, and Senator Gooch is going to go over that and some of our most recent legislative initiatives that we passed. And we're expanding sponsorship opportunities to generate additional funds, focusing on negotiating contracts with base pay for performance and maximum results. And of course, if they bring the project in sooner and quicker with the private sector, that's where the base pay enhancements come in. Next slide, please. 2010 legislation gave voters opportunity to levy an additional penny in generating sales tax by defined regions. And that's where our study committee came up with this model that took us 3 years to iron out the differences between the House and the Senate. We created, which was generally called the Transportation SPLOS, Transportation Special Local Option Sales Tax, and we've come up with a list for certain areas. You see we had 12 total regions. In each region, a panel was formed with elected officials from the counties and the cities, and they came up with the special projects that went on the ballot, and people chose whether they wanted to pass it or not. As we found out, timing is always a key in politics, as we all know. And this referendum, when it went on the ballot in 2012, was not a good time in politics, with many of the extremists not wanting anything and wanting to do it differently. As you can imagine, things didn't pass when it comes to additional revenue for government entities. However, this was simply a referendum, and it passed in Georgia in 3 regions out of the 12, so a quarter of the state passed it. And the tax sunsets after 10 years. of projects to generate is estimated to $1.8 billion for predetermined list of projects in the 3 regions. Next slide, please. You can see the different regions in the state. On the left side, the River Valley, which is the Columbus area. Fort Benning is in that area. The heart of Georgia, a little more rural area, and the central Savannah River District up to the northeast. And that is Augusta, Georgia, where the Masters Golf Tournament is held. So you can tell the different amounts according to the population and the money spent in that area, what their estimate is to bring in for those certain projects that were on the ballot for those voters to vote for. We believe that the people of Georgia will see those areas really excelling in economic development opportunities with some of the major infrastructure improvements that will go on. And we hope that this will help us maybe revise this in the near future. Next slide, please. The TIA, Transportation Investment Act, is what it was called on the ballot. The Georgia DOT is responsible for delivering of all the projects. 27 projects on the list are hybrid projects, which is a mixture of state funds, and we use those state funds that will be enhanced by the TIA to bring in additional federal funds. The project program management consultant firm, so we brought the private sector in to manage it, not the DOT. They were responsible for delivering it, but not for managing the projects. They were to retain to, again, manage the budgets and the schedules, because the legislation meant that they had to bring it in on time. And, of course, then the kicker, I think, was 25% of all the monies raised in those particular areas went, 25% of them went to the local government, the cities and the counties, according to a formula based on their population and road miles. They got 25% of that $1.8 billion to go to their projects, whether it was something, intersection improvement, a road improvement in their county or their city, or maybe a sidewalk, something that they thought was important for them in transportation, and they were completely in charge of getting those projects underway. Now, they had to bring it in on time as well. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn over to Senator Gooch, the chairman of the Georgia Transportation Committee, to go over the remaining part of this slide program with some of the bills that were passed recently.
Thanks, Jeff. One of the bills that passed this year was House Bill 817, which permanently raised the cap on design build projects from 30% to 50%. That was in 2012. 2013, we passed Senate Bill 70, which authorized design build best value procurement. That's a big move for Georgia. I think we were only one of 3 states in the U.S. that do not utilize best value procurement. And as of this July, we now have that tool in our toolbox. So we were able to implement that, and I think most of you guys are familiar with it. Your states have already been doing it. So we'll be able to bring in other technology and other proposals and not necessarily have to accept the lowest value or the lowest bid. We can score these proposals based on their other technical proposals and concepts. So we think that's going to be a good enhancement for us too. Next slide. 2012, we passed HB 817, which raised the cap on quick response projects. Those are just small projects, maybe a center turn lane or a right-in, right-out lane that the DOT can go out and basically issue a contract within 30 days. They can have it in and out. They can have it built and usable versus going through a 90 or 120-day procurement process. So that was a good tool for local governments. A lot of cities get some improvements made in their downtown historical districts or whatever, so the DOT can come in and do those projects really quick and not have to go through all the red tape that you would have under a higher bid process. House Bill 202 is another tool that we created this year through the legislature. It basically takes out the congressional district requirements. Most of the states probably have congressional balance, and I don't know if you do or not, but in Georgia, we require all of our congressional districts to balance. In other words, all the money has to be the same from one district to the next. So right now we have 14 congressional districts in the state. All the districts have to have the same amount of funding spent on them, and that has to be balanced every 5 years. So we took out the requirements for our freight corridors and our interstate improvements. We could have 1 or 2 interchange projects in downtown Atlanta that could wipe out an entire 5-year district balancing. So this was a big improvement for us. The governor was pushing this bill, and we've already seen some improvements because we're making some projects come to the forefront now that would have been 3 or 4 years out. Also, 202 raised the minimum cost trigger for mandatory value engineering studies from $10 million to $50 million. That's consistent with the federal requirements. We were at $10 million, and now we're increasing that number to $50 million. That'll streamline some of these projects and get them moving faster as well. We will continue to do internal value engineering studies, but we won't be required to do it from an outside consultant type basis. Next slide. That's all we have for now. I think our time's about to run out, but we'll take questions if this is an appropriate time for it. I saw one question that came up on the slide is the Georgia sales tax at the wholesale or the retail level. And we do it at the retail level, but we index it every 6 months. We go back and we average it out throughout the state, and then we assess the sales tax at that time.
Thank you, Senators. Senator Clary, you have the floor.
You ready for me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm Senator Ray Cleary, live down in Murrells Inlet, and I thank you for allowing me to be part of this because I'm hoping to learn more what other states are doing. A little bit of what has happened in South Carolina is we have, in some aspects, a crumbling transportation system, as even our Secretary of the Department of South Carolina Department of Transportation says. We haven't raised the gasoline tax since 1987. It's at 16.7 cents a gallon. And our DOT, which is one of the largest in the state, derives around 70 to 85% of the revenues from that sales tax on gasoline, where most states it's only about 30% to pay for their transportation needs. I happen to serve both on finance and transportation, and I give much credit to Chairman Leatherman, our chairman of Senate Finance. He saw 8 bills coming in that tried to begin reforming South Carolina and giving them the funds they need. In the next 20 years, they feel they're going to be $27 billion short with a B in road needs. We've got 1,641 bridges substandard. 47% of our primary road system is poor, and 53% of our secondary road system is poor. So they're actually doing miracle work at SCDOT, being very creative, and they've done design build, and they've done bonding, and we formed the SIB, which is a state infrastructure bank to help build some of the big projects we need. So Senator Leatherman is very good on it. I also serve under Senator Grooms. He's chairman of Senate Transportation, and for the last few years that I've known him, he's trying to creatively getting money into the DOT. Near the end of session this year, and it's a 2-year session, we actually stopped June 5th. We'll go back in January. We kind of compiled the 8 or 9 bills that were available to us and tried to come up with a reform effort that would get us most of the way there or some of the way there. Unfortunately, our governor has already declared that she would veto any tax increase on gasoline. So our committee focused on fees and generating fees in order to try to meet the needs of South Carolina. If you'll go to the next page, page 2, you'll notice that in state rankings, South Carolina, as far as miles maintained, we're probably 4 in the nation, but as far as receiving the motor fuel use, we're the 4th lowest. And when you consider that's basically 90% of the revenues from DOT, that even stands out even more so, in that there is just not funds available, and they've been postponing and postponing the hard decisions on going where we need to be to get our infrastructure needs where they need to be in South Carolina. If you'll go to the next page, funding. Just to get to the good part, remember I mentioned how many substandard bridges we had, how many roads were in poor shape, and we all know that it takes more money to repair a road if it's in poor situation than if it is in a good situation. You can see that we're looking at quite a bit of income that we need to generate over the next few years in additional funding. You know, we see what the current funding levels are in that map, and you can see how we've got to our hands kind of full of how we're going to generate the rest of the money. And here again, that does not cover any needs that the rail system may have or any other modes of transportation. DOT focuses mainly, as I said, on the roads. Then we'll go to the next slide. And the next slide shows the statewide capacity in the interstate system, primary system, and secondary system, and in the view of the multimodal plan that we have and some of the monies that are needed. If we can, then we'll go to the next slide. Nearly 60% of SCDOT's annual funding program comes from the federal aid program. And so that and the gasoline sales are basically what creates the revenues from the state. What's of real concern to us that have studied the program is because of CAFE standards, which everyone is aware of, the monies that DOT will get will actually start to decrease in 4 to 5 years. And not having enough money now, that is a very big concern of DOT. The second issue is the 41,000 plus miles that DOT is responsible for. We would like at some point in time to be able to move some of those roads to a county level, local level. I believe somewhere 35 or 45% of those roads are less than a mile long. 60% of South Carolina roads are state-owned, where the national average is only 19%. And as I had stated before, the user fee is 16 cents, and it was last increased in 1987. So now we'll kind of talk about the preliminary plan that we have. We didn't have a lot of time when so we'll go to the next slide, Senate Finance Committee plan. We took a House bill that was sitting in there because we could strike and insert, as everybody on this panel knows what that means. And so we looked at how we could change it, adding some of what was thought of in the other 6 or 7 bills that were presented to us. And we tried to look at 5 components that we could maybe move quickly. Unfortunately, because of other legislative priorities, and maybe fortunately, we'll probably take this up in January and have a full debate on it. And in January, when we have a full debate on it, we'll be able to add through amendments and other things sources that may hopefully fix the problem once and for all to a great degree. But the 5 components are, we have a major interstate and bank improvement fund. One of the things that South Carolina feels they can do is bond, but you can only bond things that have a 15-year life or longer, and you can only bond based on fees, not on taxes. So what we're attempting to do is use the bonds, the revenue bonds from the state, probably GO bonds. We did a major bond issue about 15 years ago for education, so that will be paid off in the next year or two, which frees up about $70 million where we could bond $500 or $600 million for some of these interstate bridge improvement acts. We're also changing South Carolina is interesting in that if you buy a plane or an automobile, the most you can pay is $300 in tax for the initial purchase. We would like to change that from a tax to a fee. By changing it from a tax to a fee, that allows us to bond it. That would be about $80 million a year, which would mean we could bond up to about $800 million per year to fix some of these bridges and roads that are in crisis mode. By fixing them early, we can fix them less expensively than if we wait for them to fall down. The third aspect is the motor vehicle fuel user fee, an index fee to CPI. If we can get that through, the first year it would only generate an additional 0.4 of a penny to the cost of gasoline, but by the 5th year it would create a $135 million annual fee coming to DOT, which would increase every year, and that annual fee is about what the cost of SCDOT is in their resurfacing needs. So just that user fee alone, and because it's a fee and not a tax, we feel like we may have a better ability to get it through. We also looked at all our vehicle and driver's fees. We are one of the lowest in the Southeast. We charge $25 every 10 years for a driver's license, and we charge, I believe, $24 every 2 years for vehicle tags, and we were going to change the driver's license by $1 per year and the vehicle fees by about $6 increase. When you add all 3 of those up, it would come up to the average driver paying about $11 in additional fees. The Truckers Association and the truckers have agreed to about a 16% increase in theirs. At one time it was suggested 33%. We thought 16%. They asked if they could do that in 4 payments instead of all up front, and we felt that was fair, and we're going to work with them on that. If we could go to the next slide, please. The Interstate and Bridge Improvement Fund, the revenue funds for the South Carolina Infrastructure Bank, we call it the SIB, S-I-B. The majority of members of the SIB are people picked by the governor or the legislative branch, and because of that, it's not viewed as an arm of the legislature. And because of that, we have some additional benefits with Wall Street, and it doesn't affect state ratings as much. But as I said, by eliminating the sales tax and basically calling it a fee, we can basically use that registration fee, put it into the SIB, and what I would call a restricted SIB, so that DOT could, help the SIB plan on the projects that they would take on. The SIB may use this bonding based on interstate and bridge improvement funds on existing capacity and improvements only. We feel like we've got enough problems with what we need to fix that we don't need to necessarily go in and look for new projects. And at this point of time, that's why we call it more of a restricted SIB. By bonding it, we can get to those things early, and as I said before, you can only bond things with a 15-year life or longer. And the projects will be chosen both by the SCDOT Commission, SCDOT, and what we call Act 114. Next slide, please. In the Transportation Infrastructure Act, that's where I talked about where the educational bonds that the state has had for about 15 years is coming up. which allows the state to do another $500 million in bonds without putting our children in jeopardy, because we've been paying that bond off over the last 15 years, and that will be, again, that will be somewhat restricted, but this project will be totally through the SCDOT Commission according to the priorities. Again, it's bonded money, so it has to go for projects that have a 15-year life or longer. Next slide, please. Motor fuel user fees, 16 cents. It was the last increase. Although there is a strong sentiment to increase the tax, if we look at our neighbors with some envy. North Carolina's 39 cents a gallon, and Georgia, when you add both numbers up, comes to about 28 cents a gallon, I believe. So it's 16 cents a gallon. We are under the gun on that, but because of the governor's position, we will not. There was a representative from the Greenville area, Tommy Stringer, that got strong support from the Greenville Chamber and the Greer business community for his idea of instituting a user fee index fee. And as I said, it cannot add to the price of gasoline by more than 1.5 cents in any year, but within 4 to 5 years, it will start providing substantial funds to DOT, and those funds will increase from year to year to year by indexing them. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit about the vehicle and driver's registration license fees, and the vehicle registration fee would be from 24 to 36. We also had considered and put in there an alternate vehicle fuel. I know that a lot of states are talking about it, and at this point in time, we're looking at it. I think we're probably all encouraging a little pushback from people that own the cars, but I think when you say that it's important for those people to pay for those roads that they're using, as well as people that are using more gasoline on it, that we're probably more negotiating what that number should be. Should it be 120 or 60, or should it be a little lower, et cetera? And that will come up in the discussion when we have the debate on the floor. And the driver's license fee. Now, what we did, which was, I think, a suggestion by Senator Leatherman, and I give him very much credit for it, is that we were going to take some of those fees and distribute it to the counties. But what we were going to do as we distributed it to the counties is we were going to provide an incentive of $500,000 or more to each county that were to pass a incentive to 1 cent sales tax and use tax to fund local transportation projects. So maybe a little bit of a carrot to do it. My dental office is in Horry County, and they have done that twice, and that is why Horry County has some of the better roads in the state. And we believe also by doing the local sales action and use tax to give them an incentive, it also helps us possibly as a selling point to get these fees through the legislature. And as you noticed before, I have not mentioned tax one time, because according to the National Tax Foundation, if a revenue source is going for a particular purpose, a particular priority, then it is considered a fee. And on the local funding, if you'll please go to the next slide, we changed a little bit of that, where we think that those fees will generate $60 million plus. With 46 counties in South Carolina, we distributed them not by population, but just by 46 counties. That way the rural counties can feel like they're getting a little bit ahead of the game, because sometimes when you fix roads based on vehicle miles traveled on them, that they seem like they never can get to the top of that list. So we, at this point in time, are looking at giving the counties an initial $500,000 with additional monies if they will pass that 1 cent sales tax. What we expect and hope will happen, since we couldn't get to it and we got to it late in the season, is that we will set it for special order in January, and we will look at all the needs of DOT, whether they're for bridges, interstates, new capacity, deferred maintenance, and basically come up with fees, whether they're fees for, we have no tags on trailers in South Carolina. We don't have any fees when you consider leased cars, rental cars, as far as that going to DOT. And so we're going to have a hodgepodge of amendments that will increase some of these revenues from a diversity of sources that will protect DOT in the long run and give them the monies they need, not only to put South Carolina where it needs to be, but also fix some of the problems that have been gone for a long time. What's interesting is after we finished this, we found about 2 or 3 weeks later that a study committee was done back in 2002 or 3 under Governor Hodges, with many critical people on that committee. They gave the report to Governor Sanford in 2004, which was basically ignored for the next 9 years. So we feel like this is a good starting point, and I think at this point in time I may be close to being at the end.
Thank you, Senator. Jason, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Senator. And much like Senator Cleary's experience, Virginia's current 17.5 cent per gallon gas tax was set in 1986 and is in place for the next 16 days. And similar to many of the experiences that you've all seen this year in Virginia, there were probably 12 solid funding bills in the Senate, another dozen or so over in the House, that all began to coalesce into a comprehensive funding overhaul that is going to take place on July 1st. The bill itself is 44 pages long and weighing in at 2,639 lines of legislative text. Next slide, please. So House Bill 2313 is the result of more than a decade of legislative effort to adopt legislation to provide a dynamic, long-term transportation funding solution for the Commonwealth. By 2018, it should generate about $850 million in additional funding when fully implemented, using a combination of new and existing revenue sources, which does include almost $200 million in existing general fund sources by 2018. It also generates an additional $500 million annually for regional self-help packages in Hampton Roads, which is our southeast corner and oceanfront communities, and Northern Virginia and the D.C. suburbs. It responds to concerns that regions have placed and have set out for over a decade that they don't receive a fair share of highway funding compared to either their infrastructure needs or their proportion of tax contributions. And that's about $220 million for Hampton Roads and $325 million annually in Northern Virginia. And the final legislation really is a compromise between Governor McDonald's proposal to eliminate the motor fuels tax in its entirety and a variety of Senate bills to increase them. Next slide. Virginia's got a truly multimodal transportation system with a FY14 appropriation of over $4.9 billion, serving a population of about 8.1 million people. And it does encompass, as Senator Cleary noted, land transportation. Virginia ranks right above South Carolina in the total state-maintained lane miles, plus our dedicated rail and public transportation department, motor vehicles, our port authority, and our newly minted Virginia Commercial Space Flight Authority, which actually owns and operates launch pad facilities at Wallops Island on Virginia's eastern shore, with one successful test flight of a resupply rocket under the NASA contract and 9 additional launches scheduled from that facility right now. Next slide. Virginia is also home to 2 of the nation's most congested regions in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. Extrapolation of the data collected by the Texas Transportation Institute led us to believe that we were losing about an economic loss of about $3.7 billion annually, and that was impacting business productivity and our ability to attract employers. Virginia had constantly been either the first or second top state for business in the CNBC rankings. We slipped to 3rd last year, specifically cited as a 33rd rank in terms of investment in transportation and infrastructure. And Standard & Poor's had cautioned that infrastructure costs would increasingly fall to the state and local governments in light of federal cutbacks. And we all recognize that sequestration also can impact the federal revenues that are coming specifically from those federal general funds that are being transferred to keep the feds whole on their commitment to the states. Next slide. So why was Virginia able to accomplish something this year that it had not been able to accomplish in over a decade? First, there were a number of high-cost, high-priority projects that could not be accommodated for in our 6-year plan. That included the expansion and extension of the metro out to Dulles International Airport, several critical tunnel and bridge projects in the Hampton Roads region, and necessary reconstruction of 3 major interstates statewide. There was increasingly limited public tolerance for the reliance on toll-supported projects, and we had billboards and the Truckers Association rolling large painted yellow trucks just say no to tolls throughout the course of the legislative session this year. The governor, who's in his last year, was certainly in search of a legacy accomplishment, and he did play a very bold leadership role and took criticism from both the Wall Street Journal and more liberal-minded commenters on his proposal to eliminate the gas tax. And in the end, we had a bipartisan approach to crafting a compromise that included both new revenues and existing general funds. Next slide. Virginia has tried, I think, everything, every tool in the toolkit we have used. Virginia's Public-Private Transportation Act is one of the first in the nation. We've got over $8.1 billion in transportation infrastructure invested through the PPTA over the last 5 years, with almost $3 billion in projects going out the door in 2012 alone. Most of those projects are increasingly being funded by tolls, and we received FHWA authorization for tolling both new capacity and for maintenance as well. And there was a proposal to toll I-95 from North Carolina up through the Fredericksburg area south of D.C. Just for maintenance purposes alone. We had a series of VDOT reform initiatives. As with every administration, a series of financial and performance audits had been undertaken, and Virginia had authorized over $3.1 billion in debt since 2007, so we were pretty maxed out on the credit card as well. Next slide, please. Overall, what the theory and what the bill that came to be does is it replaces the fixed 17.5-cent excise tax at the pump with a 3.5% sales tax on motor fuel at the wholesale price and a 6% tax on diesel also at the rack. We did an alternative vehicle registration fee of $64. We already had in place a $50 fee for all electric vehicles. And we increased our titling tax from 3% to 4.15%. Those were the user fees that we brought to play. We also increased the general statewide sales tax by 0.3%. And we used revenues that we anticipate getting from Marketplace Equity or the Marketplace Fairness Act, and we dedicated them to transportation, except for the percentage of revenues that go under our existing sales tax allocation to local governments. And we increased the share of the existing state sales tax and dedicated to the Highway Maintenance Fund from 0.5% to 0.675% phased in over the 5 years. So there at the bottom you can see we expect to generate about $406 million in additional funds in 2014, increasing to almost $850 million by 2018. Next slide. Some of the guiding principles that we focused on in negotiating this legislation was the need to eliminate the transfer of state construction funding to the maintenance program. In the current operating year, more than $500 million was being transferred out of our maintenance, or out of our construction fund to support maintenance program obligations. Over $3 billion had been transferred from formula-driven construction to maintenance since 2002. That results in an equivalent amount of funding being retained in the Transportation Trust Fund and distributed according to existing formulas. We established a dynamic funding stream for intercity passenger rail, mass transit, and our debt service programs, making Virginia one of the first, if not the first state in the nation to have a dedicated stream of revenue to our statewide rail programs. This was actually something of significant concern statewide because of federal legislation known as PREA, which is requiring states to pick up Amtrak tabs, and Virginia has one of the busiest non-Northeast corridor passenger stations in the nation. It also has 2 revenue-producing lines originating in the central part of the state. And it provides a dedicated regional revenue sources through taxes imposed by the state rather than local option taxes. In 2007, we had passed legislation that did a series of local option taxes that were granted to our MPOs, and they were found to be unconstitutional. And we do use regional planning districts, the population in planning districts and various travel metrics to allow regions to grow into this new enhanced taxing structure. Next slide, please. So it addresses the shortcomings of the 30-year-old excise tax model. It allows, our forecast was stagnant based on the increasing CAFE standards and increasing use of alternative fueled vehicles. And it had a significantly reduced purchasing power when you compared it to the inputs into highway construction, and we were using the metric of the producer price index for highway. And I think that when you looked at it since 1986, our effective purchase rate of the 17.5 cents per gallon was somewhere down around 8 cents per gallon. So as you know, an ad valorem is certainly a more dynamic taxing structure, and that will allow growth factors to allow revenues to keep pace with inflation. We also retain the nexus to transportation system user fees through fuel and vehicle-based taxes by eliminating that 17.5 and replacing it with the ad valorem, and also by increasing the motor vehicle titling tax from 3% to 4.15%. Next slide. We recognize the need for all vehicles to help pay for road maintenance by expanding in that fee that we already had on electric vehicles from 50 to 64 and encompassing hybrid vehicles within that as well. And as states experiment with the VMT type taxes, this I believe is a step towards a user fee that could be based both on vehicle weight and fuel economy. As I mentioned, we recognized a need to provide dedicated funding for mass transit and intercity passenger rail operations as well. We had in fact created a fund on the books in 2011, but didn't have any funds dedicated to that. And I think what was critical to getting votes in our Senate, which is 20 Republicans and 20 Democrats, and in this case the Lieutenant Governor was not able to break the tie because it was a revenue bill, was dedicating a portion of the statewide sales tax. It was spent either for maintenance, rail, or transit. And we put 40% of the revenues from the 0.3 to rail and about 60% to transit, generating $50 million a year for rail and about $80 million a year for transit. Next slide, please. As I said, this reflects a compromise on the use of existing general funds, which was critical to maintaining the Republican support for the bill also in the Senate, where most of this battle was taking place. It increases the share of the existing general sales and use tax dedicated to transportation from 0.5 to 0.675% when fully phased in 2017. And it transfers an additional 0.5% in incremental fashion until you get that additional quarter point in the fourth year. One of the things that was unique and was one of the initiatives that was included in Governor McDonnell's original piece of legislation provides that the majority of revenues from Marketplace Fairness, Marketplace Equity Act be utilized for transportation purposes. The bill itself does include a trigger that if Marketplace Fairness is not adopted by Congress by January 1st, 2015, the rack tax will be increased from 3.5 to 5.1%, and the general fund transfers to maintenance will be frozen at the 2015 level. And there's a double trigger that if Congress does eventually pass Marketplace Fairness, then the original provisions of the legislation will go back into effect. Next slide. This table reflects those guiding principles in which we prioritize and program the lion's share of the revenues to the maintenance fund first, with some incremental new growth in the Transportation Trust Fund for new construction activities, and that is where we put the bulk of the Marketplace Fairness revenues. We also increase our Priority Transportation Fund, which is our debt service fund. We ensure DMV has operating revenues to cover their costs moving forward, because we were also facing a cliff in the cycle of driver's license registration, so we shifted about 5 years back to a 6-year license. So we were facing a natural drop-off in revenues as we get to a year in which registered drivers, by and large, do not need to go back in for any renewal for about a 2-year period. We, again, plugged the increased sales tax monies to either maintenance, mass transit, or intercity rail. And local governments and K-12 were certainly those programs. Any revenues from sales tax under marketplace fairness, K-12 and local government would still receive theirs. Very briefly going to our regional plans on the next slide. The Hampton Roads Regional Plan included some additional revenues from additional general sales and use tax and motor fuel sales taxes just for the localities that are in the Hampton Roads Planning District, and the projects that can be funded with that money have to be approved by the TPO. So regionally, it's an additional 0.7% sales and use tax. So for those localities embraced by the Hampton Roads TPO, the sales tax is going to be 6% total. That's 0.3 for the state, 0.7 for the region, and a 2.1% regional motor fuels tax for gasoline sold in that region. Next slide. Northern Virginia actually already had a regional motor fuels tax in place since 1986, so to address transportation challenges in the D.C. suburbs, we looked to an additive mix of revenue sources for that larger region, and that included the 0.7% local sales tax, a 15-cent per 100 grantors tax, and a 2% hotel tax or transient occupancy. And it will be the first for Virginia for a state-levied transient occupancy that has largely been a local funding source. Those projects have to be approved by the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, and 30% of the revenues generated are returned to the member jurisdictions for their local transportation projects for the funds generated under the Northern Virginia component. So as we look to the future in the Commonwealth, next slide, I think that refining the alternative fuel vehicle registration fee is going to be a challenge the Commonwealth will have to deal with. There is, and all of the myriad combinations of vehicles out there, we did not pick up on the double impact of the registration fee for hybrid vehicles on the diesel hybrid, because they will be paying both a higher rate of motor fuels tax under the diesel 6% plus that registration fee, and it was viewed by some as a tax on virtue. So I anticipate, based on what I've read in the papers, legislators to come in with repeal legislation for that provision next year. We certainly have to deal with the uncertain impact of the Marketplace Fairness Act and any potential effort to freeze in place those additional gas taxes if Congress fails to pass the Marketplace Fairness Act by January 2015. We'll likely be considering additional bond authorizations depending on who the next governor is, because with a growing debt service fund, in addition to servicing and defeasing existing authorizations, we will have capacity based on the revenues. And I think we'll next begin looking at sort of our composition of state and regional oversight bodies, as well as project selection and return on investment criteria in upcoming legislative sessions. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Jason. Sujit has received questions during the webinar, and he will forward them to the specific states that they were addressed to. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. So the first question is, I think it might be relevant for Virginia, and also if the other states think it's relevant, please provide some information. On the public-private partnerships, does your state try to keep the contracts with public entities in this country, or are the bids open internationally?
Virginia's experience is certainly internationally.
Georgia, Senator Mullis, is there anything you want to add to that, or Senator Gooch? Well, South Carolina? Senator Cleary?
I know that we're looking at two or three road projects. I think we'll look wherever the funds are there, so we would probably look internationally.
Okay. This is for you, Senator Cleary. How much GO debt does South Carolina currently have, and how much do you propose in the future?
How much debt?
Yeah, GO debt, yeah.
The GO debt, I think, and I will tell you that when we had our meetings, we had it with the Assistant Treasurer of South Carolina, and one of the things that he focused on was that when Wall Street looks at a state, especially a state like South Carolina, they want to see a comprehensive plan. They don't want to see just we have a major issue and we start to throw money at it, and then we have another major. They want us to look at all major issues, whether it's education, roads, whatever. And so that's why we're trying to create a comprehensive plan on this. But the GEO debt that was being paid off in 2017 was from school funding. That will become available at that source of $70 million a year. Can be transferred to GEO debt by the state. We have somewhat been fortunate because I don't think we have done any bonds in the last 9 or 10 years. So a lot of our bonds are coming due. Now the state infrastructure bank, SIB, which is and it's an outsource of South Carolina, but it's not viewed as a legislative agency, is able to take, as I said, fees based and do a 10-for-1 bonding match. And so we're well in our capabilities there.
Very good. Thank you, Senator. This question, I think it's the final question because we're kind of running out of time here. Jason, I think it's for you. Registration fee for hybrids and EVs in the Virginia bill is the same, $64. Hybrid vehicles use gasoline. As a matter of fact, some hybrid vehicles use more gasoline than more fuel-efficient internal combustion vehicles, thus pay a significant amount into the gas tax. With this being the case, it seems having a flat fee for hybrids and EVs is short-sighted. Why would hybrids have to pay a fee, if any, and why would it be the same fee as an electric vehicle?
That's a very good question, and I think the question is spot on. And last year when Virginia first began trying to do a tiered registration fee based on the electric, we started with electrics at 50. We had proposed increasing that to 100 in one of the Senate iterations. The governor's bill had originally proposed including that or expanding that fee to the hybrids as well. So from a practical perspective, one of the reasons that it continued through was in order to maintain some semblance of the governor's original bill so that we continued to have buy-in from both the House, the Senate, and the executive branch. And I understand the challenges with levying the registration fee, the same for both electric and hybrid, and I think that on my last slide of things to address in the future, I believe we will look to what the appropriate level of user fee that the General Assembly deems should be collected from roadway users, and then making a dynamic structure of both vehicle weight and fuel economy based registration fees to recover that fixed amount.
Thank you, Jason. Well, I think maybe one more question. We've got maybe a minute left. This question, I guess, could be to any of the legislators, either Senator Cleary or Senator Mullis or Senator Gooch. To what degree were DOT and program reforms part of negotiating tax and fee increases?
Well, the General Assembly primarily led that debate, even though that the DOT and their leadership was involved, but the General Assembly led that debate.
Okay.
In South Carolina, we passed in, I think, 2008, a fairly extensive SC-DOT reform. Anything legislators pass always has to be tweaked a little bit when you see how the rubber meets the road, so to speak, and how that reform is being instituted. And I think you'll see that as the debate, as basically our debate will start in January on road funding, and you will start to see that debate, although you did see it a little bit when I mentioned the SIB, or I mentioned DOT doing a restricted and following Act 114. So South Carolina's addressed that issue, but I think it will be further dissected as we go into the debate on funding.
Thank you, Senator. We are running out of time, so I will now hand over proceedings to Senator Sample for a closing statement. Senator Sample?
Thank you, Sujit. Just one thing. Arkansas dealt with our alternative fuel measures, but it was tied to CNG and LNG. It had some triggers on it to encourage the build out of infrastructure. Gentlemen, I thank all of you. I'm looking forward to seeing you in Mobile. And with that, Sujit, I think we should wrap it up.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sujit. Thank you, Heather.
Georgia says thank you.